Good morning. My name is Ken Mendes, and I chair the board of directors of the Racial Unity Team. The Racial Unity Team is so pleased to welcome every one of you who joined this session. Teaching kids about race, an inquiry and invitation. The mission of the Racial Unity Team is to advance relationships among people of different racial identities, increase understanding, and reduce bias in our community. Our vision is to lay a foundation for developing racial understanding and establishing a transformational goal of developing communities that promote racial diversity and understanding. Thank you again for joining us. And this is an exciting program that we've been working on. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about what the Racial Unity Team is doing. As I mentioned earlier, we're around for 7 years, and we have been working with our schools, the legislature, Department of Education, petitioning the governor to diversify the School Board of Education. And I'm happy to say that this year we have brought in a person that we think is an excellent choice that the government had made to diversify the school board. He's a Black individual from Manchester, and I'm happy to see that. We continue to want to diversify the School Board of Education, and when the next opening comes up, the Racial Unity Team will be looking for a Native American representative to be on that School Board of Education. The other interesting statistic that I want to share with you, and why what we are doing in the community is so important, is that very few people know that the number of Asians in our state, according to the most recent census, is that we have about 2.68% Asians in our state, and Hispanics about 3%. But when you go into the local schools, on the seacoast and the major cities, Asian population is running around 4 to 5%. That's not counting children of 2 or more races. A good number of children of 2 or more races, about 50% of them are of Asian ancestry as well. So our schools in the seacoast area, typically between 5 to 6% are Asians. And that's one reason why, this topic of how we relate to Asian children is so important, especially with the current events that have happened. And so we'll be hearing some of that from our speakers as well. And today, personally, I'm delighted and honored really to introduce Dr. Monica Chu to join us this morning. Dr. Chu will be our moderator for the event, teaching kids about race and inquiry and invitation. I did some research on Dr. Chu's background, and she has a tremendously powerful and impressive background. She has a PhD in English from Emory University, an MA in English from the State University of New York, and a BA from St. Catherine's University. But what is also so important is her research areas are Asian North American studies, graphic narratives and comics, race and ethnic studies, and visual culture. Her academic articles, she's got 28 academic articles and about 6 books. And I just learned today that she's got another one in writing. And there are 2 books that impressed me. One is Asian American in New England, Culture and Community. That was written in 2009. And the other one is Drawing New Color Lines, Transitional Asian American Graphic Narrative. Dr. Chu has been with the University of New Hampshire for 24 years, and we are so delighted to have her here. And she's part of the Racial Unity Team at Asian American and Pacific Islanders Advisory Group. And without further ado, I'm going to turn over the mic to Dr. Chu.
Thank you, Ken. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on a Saturday morning, relatively cooler today at about 85 in New Hampshire. I can't imagine that I would call that relatively cooler, but given that much of our world seems to be burning, 85 feels pretty cool. So I'm just going to start out here with a brief mention of a New York Times opinion page article that came out just last month, July 18th, 2021. And it's called Really Talk to Your Kids About Race by a woman called Melinda Wenner Moyer. And her basic premise is that talking to kids about race doesn't perpetuate racism. In fact, it increases the understanding that children have of their peers. And it also assists in the self-esteem of minority children. And that suppressing discussions about race makes the situation worse. And if schools don't or won't or can't have these discussions, then parents and guardians should. And I think that, and teachers as well. So I think that that's why we're all gathered here together. So in the next hour and a half or so, we are going to approach how do we start and have age-appropriate discussions about race with our Asian American Pacific Islander children. And today's session focuses specifically on, preschool, kindergarten, up through grade 3. Other questions that might come up include, when do kids recognize race, and what does that portend for our discussions both in school and at home? And how do classroom discussions about race impact AAPI students in that room? So very quickly, the shape of the panel will be such that first I will introduce both Sarah Leonard and Dr. Bethany Silva, and then they will each present for about 10 to 15 minutes from their areas of expertise. And then we'll ask the audience to ask questions. So again, you can either raise your hand on the screen, use the reactions feature, or to type a question into the chat. And two folks will be monitoring that for me. And, please tell me if there's a question in the chat that we can address. And then finally, just a couple of rules of engagement. Please don't allow the context for your questions or your inquiry to go beyond 2 minutes or so we can get to some of the replies. And also be mindful and respectful of our panel members and each other. A phrase I heard on New Hampshire Public Radio this morning, to be exquisitely courteous. So thank you for that. All right, so I'm going to start off here with Sarah Leonard, who has a bachelor's in family studies from the University of New Hampshire. And that is a focus on education of young children, and a master's in education, in educational leadership. She is credentialed as a New Hampshire master teacher and master professional. Her research and pedagogy support the exploration of diversity and family culture. She specializes in both emergent and anti-bias curriculum, with a current focus on the development of self-identity, race, and LGBTQ+ inclusivity. She began her professional career at the Child Study and Development Center, which is part of the Family Studies program at the University of New Hampshire, where she still works. So she began her instruction and care in the toddler room in 2000 and now teaches in the Preschool 1 program. And she has taught as well in UNH's Division of Continuing Education and presented at classes in Family Studies. And I fondly remember Sarah because she taught my own children at the Child Study and Development Center, these many years ago. And she reminded me this morning that the pictures of my kids in the background are actually those that she took. So I didn't realize that she had taken those. My kids don't remember Sarah, but I certainly do. So I am so pleased to have her here this morning for her expertise. And then Dr. Bethany Silva is a research assistant professor of education and director of the Community Literacy Center at UNH, where she collaborates with professors, teachers, youth, and families to nurture New Hampshire's literacy network. She earned her doctorate in education in reading, writing, and literacy from the University of Pennsylvania, and she holds an MFA in writing for children and young adults from the Vermont College of Fine Arts. Her research focuses on developing and sustaining literacy programming that values the many ways individuals and communities engage with literacy in pursuit of their goals, specifically the way students and teachers can engage with books that feature racially diverse characters. And she won the 2017 Philadelphia Writing Project Award for outstanding commitment to practitioner inquiry and literacy instructional leadership from the University of Pennsylvania. So as you can see, we have lots of great expertise here, and I'm really looking forward to your short presentations and our discussion afterwards. So let's start with Sarah, okay? You'll have to unmute. Sarah, can you unmute?
You would think after all this time I would have this down pat, but every once in a while I have to second guess myself. Are you all able to see this PowerPoint presentation? Thank you, Monica, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. In addition to being an early childhood educator, I'm also a teacher educator and a teacher coach. So I'm working with pre-service teachers who are just entering the field of teaching, and I'm also working with teachers who have been in the field for a bit of time. My introduction to anti-bias work happened in 2003 when John Nimmo became the executive director here at CSDC, and it completely changed my approach to teaching. So I'm really excited to be able to talk about the practices that we have here at the center. So CSDC has been at the university for quite a period of time. It was established in 1929 as a demonstration site for students. We've been at our current location since 1988. We have about 80 children who are enrolled in our program currently, and 17 full-time teachers and staff that are here. We're working with about 35 students who are employed. Some of those students are here in work-study positions. Some of them are here hired hourly. We refer to all of our students as student teaching assistants, because if we say that we have a work-study student in our classroom, we're inherently sharing part of their socioeconomic background, and we just find that to be inappropriate. So we've really tried to think about the language that we use pretty clearly. We also have interns from the Human Development and Family Studies Department, Occupational Therapy, Nutrition, Psychology. So we're really working with the other majors within the College of Health and Human Services. We're also accredited by the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and we're licensed by the state. So there are certainly some requirements for us to be looking at diversity through a certain lens. And we have an inquiry approach. So our emergent curriculum really comes from implementing different provocations and really analyzing the documentation that we gather. And so I'll be sharing a bit about the self-identity work that I've done this year and kind of talk you through the process of the conversations that I've had with children, how we've thought about their thinking, and that might support you and the engagement that you have with your students or your children. So we have a diversity mission here. I'm not going to read through all of this because it's really so dense. You can find it right on the CSDC website. And it was something that grew really from our diversity, equity, and bias task force that we established in 2005. And this really worked at looking at what we had from the university as a diversity mission and thinking about how we could support not only young children, but also college-age students in thinking about diversity. When I think about the philosophies that really impact our teaching at the center, I think of Laura Smalaguzzi, who was the founder of the Reggio Emilia schools in Italy. So we would say that we have a Reggio-inspired practice at the center. Really a big focus of that is on the image of the child. So how do we view the children in our classroom? Do we view them as capable, as competent, as collaborators, as unique? And we also think about the environment as our third teacher. So the first teacher would be children. The second teacher would be the teachers, and then the environment really supporting the work that's happening. Another huge philosophy that we look to is Louise Derman Sparks. And when John was here as the director, John actually works directly with Louise on a number of things. So he would actually bring Louise into the center to do some training directly with us. She was the writer of the first edition of Anti-Bias Curriculum, and in the second and third editions, Julie Olson Edwards has joined her. We're also influenced by Magda Gerber, by Montessori, by Waldorf, by Tay Farwicki, by Forest Classrooms, and most recently, it's really been brought to my attention how integral Mr. Rogers has been in the way we think about the work that we do. I mean, when I think back to the programming that he was producing for young children, not only was he writing a script that he had checked by the psychology department to make sure that he was saying things in a developmentally appropriate way, he really broke a lot of boundaries around diversity. Thinking back to that episode where he's in the pool with the police officer, and that happened right around the time of the horrific pool incident in Pennsylvania, where people were putting bleach into the pool because there were people who were Black in the pool, and the work that he did around disabilities. So that has been core to what we've been doing. So Louise Dorman Sparks tells us that anti-bias curriculum is a way of teaching that supports children and their families as they develop a sense of identity in a diverse society. It helps children to learn to be proud of themselves and their family, respect a range of human differences, recognize unfairness and bias, and speak up for the rights of others. And so they talk a lot about having these 4 core values. The first is identity, the second is diversity, the third is justice, and the fourth is activism. And so for many years in my role as an infant and toddler teacher, we've worked a lot around identity and diversity, working with preschoolers and children who are early elementary school students all the way up to young adults and adults. You really can have an opportunity to talk much more about justice and activism. And that certainly has been a lens that we've looked at more with the Preschool 2 classroom this year, particularly around the events that are happening in our country. We read on the very first bit of January when we had returned from break, I was reading Martin's Big Words. And for years, I've read this book and I've sort of edited it, feeling uncomfortable with using particular words like murder with young children and feeling like there needed to be a level of authenticity in my conversation. And we got to one point in the book and it has the word protest. And a child said, well, what does that mean to protest? And I said, well, protest is when you stand up and you say, this is wrong and I don't agree with it. I've been to a protest and I held a sign that said, save our earth. And one of the children in our classroom you could see him puff his chest out and he took a deep breath and he said, I've been to a protest because Black Lives Matter. And I was really taken back because I hadn't been in a situation where children were using that kind of language because I hadn't been working with 4- and 5-year-olds in such a long time. That question or that conversation was followed up by another question from a child, because it does say that Martin Luther King Jr. at one point was shot and killed. And it also talks about him being arrested. And so this child looked at me and said, Sarah, was Martin Luther shot or arrested and shot? Or was Martin Luther arrested and shot? And he used his hands to really indicate, were these separate events that happened? Or was this one event that happened at the same time? Was he shot during this arrest? And so I had to take a pause, even as someone who's been in the field for a long time, really doing anti-bias work, really take a deep breath and think about this from a child's perspective. Where was he coming from in this conversation? And one of the key parts of my work with anti-bias is answering things very honestly with children in a developmentally appropriate way, and then following up with families after, because I know that children are going to go home and have conversations and wanting families to have some resources. So around the time that we read this book, we ended up sending several articles out to our families to say, we've had a really deep conversation around racial inequity, and children are asking a lot of questions. If they're asking these questions at home, here are a couple of resources that might support you in answering your child's questions best. I'm happy to share those if people would like them. I'll just have to dig in my email for them. It is never too young to talk about race. So I've kind of got this infant lens on as I head back to the infant room in a week and a half. And so we know that infants are able to distinguish between the races of their caregivers by the time that they're 3 months old. Now, the biggest challenge to that in New Hampshire is that all of the caregivers at our school are white. We don't often have a lot of applicants who are not white. It being in New Hampshire, looking at the teacher education programs, we're getting a lot of the applicants that our programs are growing, but certainly are not as racially as diverse as we would prefer. You know, I've had children in the toddler room ask questions around race, very specifically, like, hey, that woman's got black skin. What's going on with that? I remember when we were reading Martin's Big Words, one of the questions was, well, you keep saying black. His skin is brown. And really trying to tease out some of the language that we have been using. As you can see by this graph, you know, children are able to distinguish between race at a very early age. They're able to just discern between caregivers of the race that they are and other races. It impacts the way that they choose their playmates. And so it's imperative that we are having these conversations with children very early on. In my classroom this year, we certainly have lower numbers than we typically would, just to keep smaller group sizes to prevent the spread of COVID. But it is not uncommon for me to have at least 30 to 35% of my class who identify as Asian American Pacific Islanders. There have been years where I've had a large cohort of Hispanic students in my classroom. So at the beginning of the year, we're having a lot of conversations with families around their backgrounds and how we can partner with them in our classroom. When I think about self-identity, we have a number of things that we're looking at. We're looking at that self-identity and social identity, individual autonomy, initiative, like what kind of learner are they? What are their approaches to learning? Curiosity, their understanding of family, relationships, attachment, self-care, compliance, and these all come from right from the early learning standards that actually our assistant director helped to write. So this is a web. We use a lot of webbing to develop the curriculum in our classroom. And so we really dove right into self-identity. So there was certainly this piece about emotional development and self-advocacy, but we started to do a lot of work around self-portraits. We had a student in our classroom who was really interested in that. And quite honestly, the lens that I really worked to look at our curriculum through this year was, how do we look at the silver linings of COVID, right? So I could be in a situation where I could be very frustrated that children have to wear masks. I don't want to wear a mask. I know children don't want to wear masks, but we need to wear masks to take care of one another. And so I thought, okay, well, if we're going to start looking at self-identity, let's capitalize on these masks. We're going to hyper-focus on eyes. And for children, you're really going to have that opportunity to focus much more easily because the rest of your face is covered for the most part. So we looked at that through a number of different ways. This web was made at the beginning of our semester. We partnered with our college students to create this, and any of the things in blue were things that we hadn't quite gotten to yet that we wanted to make sure we could still cover in our curriculum. So the first thing that we did was take photographs of children in their eyes. We made strips that just had their eyes on them. We offered them gems. And it was interesting because at the very beginning of this process, all of the children identified that their eyes were round. My eyes are circular. Very rarely they'd use oval as a descriptor, but it was really about round. And so they spent a lot of time working with these gems. They ended up creating a box of gems for the toddlers because they had also been interested in that work. So it offered us the opportunity to have some cross-classroom collaboration. And at that point in time, there were 4 children in our classroom who had brown eyes, 3 of those children are Asian American, and none of them made the connection that their eyes might be the same color because they also shared the same racial identity. And so my co-teacher and I kind of kept that not away from them, but we really wanted to have an opportunity to do some work and then reflect back with children on that. We did a lot of work around using transparencies, kicking it a little old school. I'm not sure, they're very difficult to find now, and really offered children another opportunity to think about the shape of their eyes. Monica, you might not be able to recognize, we actually taught in the large room. This is a classroom space that we created there because we needed to keep smaller group sizes. And so children would come back to this work every day that they were in the classroom. This work lasted for, I want to say 2 months total, just about eyes. We offer strips of paint. Actually, Jackie Stillwagon, who's on this Zoom call, cut all of these strips of paint for us. They're from the hardware store. And so we have a practice of letting children create the names for the items in our classroom. And so I could very easily say, these are some paint strips. We can figure out what color our skin might be. Our children decided that they would call them skin showers, because they would show us the color of our skin. And in this middle photograph, the conversation that started was a child saying, well, I'm white. Are you white? You know, white is a term that we use, but is your skin truly white? And so they spent a lot of time going through, and we actually put white pieces of paper in so children can look and compare the color of their skin. The other thing I appreciate about this practice is that many of the books that we have that talk about racial identity or skin tones relate them to foods. And while I find that to be practical and sometimes consistent with where children are in their learning, sometimes it can be uncomfortable for people as well. And so these paint strips offered just some more language around the words that we could use to describe all of the different colors of brown. And we've got a couple of different books too that talk about skin tones. Like this is another one, Shades of Brown, which is a newly released book. I have also a book list of the things that we've used this year that I'm happy to share as a resource. Then we started to do some more sketching with eyes, pencils, pens, colored pencils. And again, children really represented their eyes circularly. And again, we did that, like how much conversation do we lead with what is happening in the classroom? And then they created self-portraits. Our student teacher for the spring semester worked with children to take the skin showers that they had claimed as their own and mix paint to be the same color as that skin shower. And they're actually in jars behind me. I tried to set up like what it might look like if we were doing self-portraits in our classroom. And again, eyes all around. And we've asked children, like, do you think, let's look at your eyes. And I thought I need something else to kind of spark this conversation with children. So we started to look at diagrams of eyes. And for me, this was a huge wake-up call. Children wanted to know how to label the different parts of their eyes. And the photo, the image on the right, where it says parts of the human eye, was one of the only images I could find of eyes. And so my co-teacher, Kristen, and I were chatting, and I was like, this is a problem. Not only is it a problem that we only have, half of our class has blue eyes, but we're not offering any level of diversity in eye color, in the shape of their eye. Where are all these images? And as we dug, all we were finding were Caucasian people with blue eyes as those diagrams of eyes. So we thought, okay, we're going to wait a little bit longer. We'll do a little bit more digging and see what we can find. We did end up finding the photo on the left, but we had decided, like, if we can't find this, we're going to have to create it. As educators, we have to be really discerning about what images we're showing and what bias might be sent, or what message might be sent to children without us intending. The other thing that we found fascinating is if you tried to find any pictures of eyes, excuse me, of eyes for someone who is Black. It almost exclusively talked about eye conditions or eye illnesses. And so that's certainly an area that we're going to be revisiting as educators of what can we do to really shift that narrative, at least in the aspect of using eyes as part of our self-identity work. We use a lot of books in our classroom. My husband's not on the call, so I can say I've spent a lot of money this year buying books to support some of that work in our classroom. You know, when I look at books, there are certainly historical books and folk tales. There are some books I don't choose to read in the classroom anymore, or if I do, I read with a different lens. So like Tiki Tiki Tembo is one of those classic books that can be in classrooms. However, is that really the message I want to be sending to children about the way that Chinese children are named? No. For a long time, if I was looking for books that had protagonists or even characters who were Asian American or Pacific Islander, you could only find them in books that had talked about adoption. And there are certainly books that have the explanation of culture. So like Bibimbap is a great book, but it does talk a lot about the practice of making the bibimbap, which is not a bad book. I love that book, but it is one classification of book that I look at when I look at books in my classroom. Then I think about books that just have characters in them or people in them who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Then there are books that have protagonists that are, so the main character is right there as someone who is Black, Indigenous, people of color. And it's not necessarily about them being Black or Indigenous or a person of color. It's just a book that has a character or that main character as someone who is BIPOC. And then kind of that next level is authors and illustrators. So really taking that opportunity to elevate voices in the field and with the books that we're offering. So I have recently gotten the book, Eyes That Kiss in the Corner. That was the other kind of reflection that we had. It was really challenging to find ways to describe eyes other than almond. Almost every example of supporting conversations with children and describing the shape of eyes, particularly eyes of a child who is Asian, talked about almond shaped, and none of our children really felt like that was an accurate description, but all of them were really drawn to this book, Eyes That Kiss in the Corner. And so a number of children participated in revisiting the work of their eyes that they had done before. And I chose the work of two children who were particularly engaged, but also that it really shifted their own image of themselves. So in this photograph, you can tell that this child has really focused on thinking about how the corners of his eye might look and how that is different. And even having that opportunity to look and say, the first time we read the book, he said, I've watched this video online and I love it. And I love this book because they look like me. And it was so powerful. In this photograph,
Wait, Sarah, can I interrupt for one quick second with courtesy? I'm just wondering if we might want to move on to Bethany, just so
this is the last slide I've got.
Okay, all right, sorry.
Sorry to ramble.
I'm just doing my moderation.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Monica. Yeah. And so in this last photograph, this child has really shifted the practice that she had in looking at her own eyes. And that came from not only seeing images of herself, but seeing images of other Asian American or Pacific Islander characters in books. So the last couple I have is CSDC. And if you want to find us, we're on Facebook, and we also have a page through the university. So.
Thank you very much. All right.
Figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Sarah. So Bethany, you're up next. Thank you.
Sarah, that's thank you so much for that. My work has been with older children, and I hadn't heard too much about the anti-bias curriculum, and I'm excited to read into that now.
Yeah.
So,
thank you. I can't wait to see your presentation.
Oh, it's funny, we have an overlap on one of our books that we look at. Although, actually, no, that's not true. Not Martin's big words. It's my daddy, Dr. Martin Luther King, kind of led to some of the exploration that I've done in New Hampshire. All right. So hi, everyone. I am Bethany Silva. I'm Research Assistant Professor of Education and the Director of the Community Literacy Center. If you are interested in accessing the slides, I put a lot of links to resources on them. And so please feel free to follow this tiny URL that is there. The slides are set on, anyone can view them. So if that is something you want to do, please feel free to grab a screenshot right now, and then you can go right there. The pictures on the right-hand side are from one of the programs that we get to run at the Literacy Center when we can be in person. It's called Book to Art, and we read books and we make art. And so I'd like to, when I present on conversations through books with small children, I like to make sure that some of those small people are right there with their faces. And these are a different kind of masks that we made in relationship to a book than the kinds of masks we are wearing right now. So I have two slideshows going at the same time. So I have, I kind of walked through my why engage with diverse literature with children. And so I have some slides that have to do with that. And I am going to skip them and just for time. And if someone has questions about it later, really the answer is when we talk about things, we learn and grow. And it's important to have conversation and dialogue about books that are both within and outside our realms of current understanding. But I have a whole spiel about how some of the things that I keep in mind. And I'm happy to go back to all of those. And I think this is going to accidentally play when I hit go. Oh, no, we didn't. And then we have two people who are a big part of my why. And then another piece. Okay, so happy to return to that later. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about how, and also give some interactive experiences of how people might engage young children in conversations as they're reading diverse literature. So as I was thinking about who the audience for this might be, I was thinking about the fact that some of the people here are going to be parents. Some of the people are going to be teachers. Some of the people are going to identify as a person of color. Some of the people are going to identify as white. And so I really wanted to think across some of the practices that I put in place for different situations, both as an educator and as a parent. So the next slide, here we go. When I'm reading books with children, prior to any reading, I am considering these components. What are the age of the people who are taking part in this? What is the setting? What's the purpose of the reading that we're doing? What's the background knowledge of the children I'm working with? And how do these people identify? So that's because the questions that arise, the ways I'll answer those questions, and the ways I'll invite discussion all relate to this. So, for example, if I'm a white parent reading to a white child, I might be seeking to expand her racial literacy. So I need to think in advance about how to develop that racial literacy without normalizing deficit perspectives or creating a feeling that racism happened only in the past. If I were a parent of color reading to my child, I also might be thinking about what mirrors the book held up to my child and what questions it might bring up about how she understands her own racial identity. And for classroom teachers, our own identities as well as the identities of our students come into play. It's important for teachers who are white to consider the purpose and setting of any read aloud. while also considering age, background knowledge, and identities of their students. So a lot of teachers have heard the mantra, like, don't ask children of color to speak for their race when you're having classroom discussions around diverse books. It's also important to consider that a white child who lacks racial literacy can do real emotional damage to the children of color in the room. One example of a very nervy moment in my classroom was I had students making memes, which involved an image and some text. And the memes were about our internet usage rules, but one student chose to use a meme that was a watermelon meme, which had really negative racial undertones. And that student was white, had no idea what they were doing. And it was very important that I stop the class and say, okay, so I suspect people don't realize what just got said, or some people don't, other people might, and walked them through what that watermelon meme meant racially. And I had to pause and like hold back any feelings I had, because I wanted to go, oh, how could you? And instead I needed to call all the students into a discussion of what happens when we use images that we don't necessarily understand what they mean. So after considering the audience, I also think about my role as the adult. So the adult jobs are get fluent, translate to kids, embrace discomfort, and demonstrate your own learning. So getting fluent, teachers joke that in order to teach simple addition, we need to understand math on a calculus level. Our job as adults is to understand the racism, and history in the books we read with children on a calculus level. And so one good example is I was reading My Side of the Mountain with my son the other day, and we came to a part where there was a sign. I'm not even sure exactly why it was in the book, but there was a sign that the main character read that talked about a massacre that was committed by Native Americans on that site. And I was like, what is going on here? And so I needed to have a discussion with my son about the portrayal of Indigenous people in books, and why would the author necessarily have included this moment. And this is a precious book to a lot of people. My Side of the Mountain is something that is a book that people love. But even those books that are precious to people have racially charged moments in them, and they also have moments that will help children to develop a sense of what is appropriate, and not understanding the history of Indigenous representation in children's literature would have meant that we might have skipped right over that part. And then translating to kid. So it's my job to understand race, racism, and history on a calculus level, but then I have to translate to kid. And I don't think of that as simplifying. I think of it as translating. So that involves considering the child's age, background knowledge, temperament, and interests, and then being clear, complete, and honest. So I'm never looking to be simple. I'm looking to explain in a way that makes sense. And so one thing I heard Sarah talking about was that's something that she also has to think about very much in her classroom as well, is, okay, well, how do I describe a moment where, how do I describe a moment where Dr. King was arrested? Like, what is understandable about that for a 2-year-old? And so that is an important part pre-reading for me, is to anticipate questions and think about how will I answer them in a way that's appropriate to the children that I'm reading with. And then discomfort. There's been so much research on the feelings of discomfort that arise when talking about race. And my goal with children is to acknowledge and feel my discomfort, and also to keep talking about race, so that the children that I work with and the children that I raise will grow up with racial literacy and an understanding that it is something to talk about and understand better, and to constantly be learning. And then demonstrating your own learning. The goal there is to develop comfort saying, I don't know. And when you learn something that's different from what you thought, acknowledge that you learned it. That is something that children really value. So coming over to this, are we going to move ahead? Sorry, I have two screens going. Oh, I went too far. I was on vacation and my computer, I'm going to stop my share for 1 second so that I can get the screen to go back. My computer decided that it was going to be very angry at me for having been away from it for a week. And so now I can represent the screen. All right, so we'll go back into viewing it, present. Okay. So one of the methods that I like to use for getting a conversation going with children is borrowed from Art Education. And this is a free resource for anyone to use, but it works both in classrooms and it works as a parent. And so I'm going to walk you through how it goes. And if you go to the slides, you can steal the resource anytime you want. I mean, use the resource. It's meant for everyone to use it. All right, there we go. Okay, so the first thing that you do is you look, or you don't, because, oh, there we go. You look. So you begin by asking everyone to look at an image quietly for a few moments, which gives them an opportunity to digest the visual information. And then you describe. So you have students describe what they notice about the work of art. What do we see? What more can we find? You might write the observations down if you're in a classroom. And actually, if you're a parent, you might as well. Although I find that when I'm doing this with my children, we usually just talk about what we observe. Then we ask more analytical questions. What do we think about what we see? What do our observations tell us about the story, idea, mood, or feeling of the work of art? And then we discover. So if factual questions arise, we might Google what we need to learn more about, and we consider what new thoughts we have. And then we respond. We have personal responses. How does the artwork relate to your own life experience and prior knowledge? So we're going to try that with this book called Maybe Something Beautiful. And so what I'm going to have everyone do is we're going to spend about a minute looking at the picture, and you might count things like triangles, or you might observe color, or you might observe the structure of the painting in Maybe Something Beautiful. This is a book about how art changed a neighborhood, and it's semi-autobiographical about a neighborhood in San Diego. So please go ahead and just stare at this picture for a moment. Okay, now that you've had the chance to look at it, could you please drop, this is the way we have to do it on Zoom. Normally in a classroom, people might raise their hands or people might write it on a Post-it and bring it up to the board. Or if I'm reading with my child, they might, might have my child just, tell me, what do you see? But please describe what you notice about the work of art. And your goal here is not to interpret, you're just describing what you see, and go ahead and put it in the chat. So far we have 2 half sons, a female child of color. Oh my gosh, we're moving so fast now, it's great. Buildings in the background are shades of gray versus emerging bright painting. Public art, my eyes are drawn to the pink banner. The sun in the background sky looking toward the girl painting. Bright colors, happy sun, active child, warm colors, smokestack in the background. 2 suns, incinerator, swirls of smoke. See if any more come up. Thank you. Fire escapes on the building in the background. Large can of paint. You can't see the girl's face. The paint is red, but the painting is multicolored. I know, right? It's like magic paint. The blouse is the same bright colors as painting. Absolutely. Floral blouse. All right, so now, what are you thinking about what you're seeing? How are you, what do your observations tell you about the story or the idea or the mood or the feeling? You can go ahead and put it in the chat. I see a gray city is brightened through public art. It's a happy story, a sense of contentment, creating happiness. The color juxtaposed against the gray tells me this is a story of hope. The color transforms the gray city to color garden. Even though we can't see her face, the sun smile and the paint brings warmth. The young have something to say. Sarah, this book is amazing, and I hope you use it at the CSDC, by the way, because it leads directly to justice and activism, because the city is sad and gray, and then the community comes together to make it beautiful through art. She is spreading her internal brightness to the world. We assume the painter is a girl, female protagonist. By this point, we do know that she is female. It is true. Because it leads with, there was a little girl and she gives paintings to everybody and then she gives them to an artist. Oh, good, I'm glad you have it on your list, great. So we haven't really come up with any factual questions, but I know that when I'm reading this with students, one of the things that comes up is like, is this real? Is this true? And so we'll often use that moment to go look at the back matter in the book, and we'll talk about the fact that she's, is, the little girl is not real. The artist is real, and the artist who illustrates the book is real. And he began a project within his neighborhood to create community art to make the neighborhood more beautiful. And then we'll go look at some of the pictures of that neighborhood and how that project worked. The next step is to invite personal responses. So how does this relate to your own life experiences and prior knowledge? How does, have you ever been a part of an art project? How do you feel about art? How does art make you feel? Share anything that you want to.
Bethany, I don't mind sharing, and I don't know if it's easier to unmute for this part, but as I saw this, I couldn't help but to think about what's happening currently in Rochester, where there's this huge initiative to create community murals. And it really made me think about what the impact to the curriculum in the elementary schools or in the middle schools could be in exploring a book like this within their art programs. And with my own children, because that's the community I live in.
Oh, I love it. I remember what, let's see, Sarah of the Makery in Durham did with that wall that was next to her shop before it closed down because of COVID. So she really sponsored folks to paint that wall, and it makes such a difference. And since I'm unmuted, and to be fair, I just am wondering, you know, Bethany, if you can just wrap up in a few minutes so that we can have a half an hour for questions. It's all really great information. Thank you. And I hate to do this part of my job, but I'm going to do it.
Oh, that's fine. And I recognize that I've gone on too long. Okay, so that one took a while. I will wrap up, and then I see also I'll read into the transcript to make sure it goes on the video. Her name is Mira, and the sun is an important part of Mexican indigenous pre-colonial spirituality. I don't know if the author is Latinx. Yes, the author is Latinx. And I think that is an important part of this book. So I am going to move forward. So I also like to anticipate questions. And so one of the things, this is a book called Drum Dream Girl, and it is a true story about a young woman from Cuba who was one of the first female drummers to come out of Cuba. And it's a poem. And so with this particular book, we end up with a lot of situations where you have everyone on the island of music in the city of drum beats believe that only boys should play drums. And so you're going to get questions like, why would they believe something stupid like that? And you would also get, what is an island of music, right? Why would the author be calling it an island of music? And so sometimes the questions that children ask might relate to just simply understanding a book, and sometimes they relate to also understanding culturally why a place might be having why there might be a rule in place in a different place. Another rule of thumb I have is saying, I don't know, let's find out more about that. So the example for that is, this is from a book called Mama's Nightingale. And the author of this book writes, or the story of this book is about a mama who has been detained by ICE, and her daughter starts a letter writing campaign to help her mom be released from the detainment center. And when I was reading this with students, one of their big questions that they had for me was, why is the mom in jail? Why would writing letters get the mom out of jail? And I realized I had thought that I understood the story, but I needed to understand rules about ICE detainment better. And so I said, you know what, hold the phone. And I went out, we did some Google searching to understand. And it was because she was being illegally detained by ICE, in that she was only allowed to be detained for 48 hours without being charged. And so they needed to understand that. This was with second, third, and fourth graders. And they most certainly understood that concept of, like, there's a certain amount of time that it's legal to be detained. And so the daughter was able to have some agency in that. So I will hold off on my talk about which books, but I have some thoughts about that as well. some big considerations. Who solves the problem in the book? Is it an own voice as author? What's the time period? Does it just give you a single story about any one group of people? And is it covered in awards? Covered in awards is usually a good sign, especially if there are specific awards that have to do with promoting diversity in children's literature, and those are very useful places to start. So I'll stop my share there and let everyone open up for questions.
Great, thank you, Sarah and Bethany. So I don't know, were there any questions, Bryn, that came up in the chat?
No. I would suggest that people just unmute themselves. There are not a lot of us, and so maybe it makes for a rich conversation if people just speak out.
Yeah, Ken poses a question in the chat that says, is the colorblind or color brave approach the best way to address racial diversity with young children? And I think, I think back to, I grew up in the 90s, or well, 70s, 80s, 90s, and my college essay was about colorblindness because that very much was the lens that we were taught through at that time. And I think when we use that approach to think about things in that colorblind way, we really shut down conversations for children, and we stop thinking about the importance of being able to see and acknowledge differences and celebrate those. And I think that a lot of times when I see that happening in a classroom, it's often because there's a teacher who doesn't necessarily know how to answer the questions that might come up. It's easier to say, oh, we don't see that, we don't see that. I remember in the toddler room, there was a child who said, hey, who's that black lady? What's she all about? And the teacher that was in the room with me kind of did this like, whoa, what's going on? And really, the question that child had was, I've never seen a teacher with that color skin caring for children. And so sometimes what we need to do is really ask more questions to get at the real question that children have. And I found it really helpful to actually to tell me more about what you're thinking about. And I think that's something that Bethany certainly touches upon in her presentation of that, figuring out, asking more questions, anticipating questions that might be happening.
Sarah,
To
that's a
piggyback on that, it is to ask the question, and this is something that Bethany, you talked about, what happens in those moments when, especially you're a teacher, and you seem to have been able to amenably work with the situation, but there are other times, in my classroom, in the college classroom, what happens when someone says something and you don't know how to answer it, right? So you might want to respond first to the colorblind, and then if you could both respond as well to what happens in those moments as a parent, a guardian, a teacher, and you don't know what to say at the moment, what can you do, to address?
Sarah, I was just thinking, as you mentioned that you wrote an essay for college on colorblindness, I realized I was so indoctrinated into colorblindness as well that I wrote a paper on why we should be colorblind in admissions procedures in college that I've been mortified about for years. So I think, the problem with colorblindness is that it doesn't acknowledge the different ways that people live their lives, like the different ways that people experience their lives based on the differences in how the world treats people based on race, right? And so I think that color blindness is it's very much out of fashion. But that doesn't mean saying like, oh, this is exactly how every person of whatever race is experiencing the world at all times, which is I like to lean on that was the danger of a single story slide. I like to lean on that idea is, if you have just one idea or one narrative about any one group of people, that is also a very dangerous way to be, right? Like, so if we're thinking about activism in the in the civil rights, if we're only thinking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is wonderful and amazing and important part of the story, the narrative, then we're still only having one story, and we're not learning about all the activists and all of the community members who are coming together. Actually, the reason that came up was because I have this book on my called The Youngest Marcher, which is about children who took part in the civil rights. And you do still end up having to talk about why would they go to jail. And the answer to that one is that Gandhi created a type of protest called civil disobedience, where people found laws that were unjust. So they were laws that don't make sense. And they would break those laws to demonstrate that those laws don't make sense and they are unjust, and to help change the laws. And so in breaking the laws, they would end up going to jail. And so that was why Dr. King was arrested. And that was why all the children in this book get arrested. They do it on purpose. And I found that explanation both helps to root historically the activism, and it also helps to let very young children understand that idea, especially when you start asking them, well, what are unjust rules? And then they start talking about the rules in their classroom, and which ones make sense and which ones don't. Okay, that was the first part. What was the second part, Monica? I forget the second part of the question. Oh, you're on mute.
What happens in those moments when a student says something or a child says something, you're not quite sure how to approach it? What can you do?
Oh, that's the whole stop. Let's go. We need to stop and figure this out. And there's different types of things that they might ask. They might ask a question that you just don't know the answer to yet, right? And so you have to go do more research. And so in that case, it's that's the response that I do with that one. When someone says something hurtful, I tend to stop and call people in and say, okay, this was just said, here's some context for that. If I don't know exactly what to do about it, or if I think that if the person who said it had if the person who said it had a negative intent, I actually haven't had that experience. I've had more experiences with people not realizing what they were saying. But if someone had a negative intent, I think my mental plan is always to stop them and say, we're going to follow up on this later and have an individual conversation with them later about it. You don't get that with preschoolers. They're not trying to be hurtful. That's not their thing.
Well, occasionally we do, but not certainly. I don't think it ever has really happened for me around race. I think there are a couple of words that we think about in preschool pretty regularly. One is observe. So we're looking at things carefully, and the other is reflect. We need time to think about things. And so if I'm ever on the spot, there's certainly that pause for perhaps research, but sometimes I say that I need a thinking minute to collect my thoughts about how I'm going to respond. We also do a lot of work around the zones of regulation in self-regulation. And so the zones, red is angry, yellow is excited, green is that just right, and blue is sad. And so I will acknowledge as part of my practice kind of that, ooh, you asked that question. For some reason, my body went right into the yellow zone. So I've got to kind of get my body back to green so we can have this conversation together. And I explain why I had that reaction. I think the same can be true in that period of reflection around that, the college essay about color blindness. So it invites an opportunity, particularly with our college students, to talk about the evolution of our thinking, right? And so we've learned something at a point in our life that we held to be true, and we have the right and the ability to grow and learn. And so I hope that it becomes an invitation and a little bit of vulnerability when I'm having conversations with students, particularly around race and identity.
Cora, you have a question?
Yeah, so thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Bethany, for being part of this panel discussion, or for being the panel discussion. My question is, how do you respond to kids? And I don't know if the kids that we're speaking about, the pre-K to grade 3, say this. How do you respond when kids say you are racist? Or that's, you know. I mean, I have my own opinion about it, but.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on if something is racist or not. You know, I was once sitting at a table with a group of children, and one of the children was pointing around the table and said, black, white, black, white, black, white. There's a pattern. And another child said, shh, that's racist. And so in that situation, I said, let's talk about that. What does being racist mean to you? And so they had a wonderful conversation about, are we allowed to talk about race? Is talking about race racist? Is, you know, is identifying that someone has, is of a race, a racist act? And so I guess, as with all things, I try to open it up to discussion. If they say something, if they name something as racist and it's the same discussion, except it's okay, so how do we identify that that's racist, and why would it be racist?
So the finer point that I find challenging, my offspring is 36 years old, so this is not for her, and she is very, very, you know, she's an activist, so she understands a lot about this. So I think the finer point is when we say to people, or if you don't react when people say, I'm not racist, right? I have, you know, members who are Black, or I have members who are Latino in my family. So let's just say I'm Caucasian. So I couldn't possibly be racist. So how do we teach children that there's a difference between being racist and saying a joke, for example, that is racist? Because I think that is the challenge that teachers, parents are facing now with regards to HB2 in the budget, for example, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak certainly from a personal standpoint. I remember for pretty much most of my childhood, my dad was a bit like Archie Bunker, which probably ages me a lot. And so the challenge was that he had a lot of friends that were people of color. And so that was really what he said, well, I can't be racist because. And so for me, there's this identification of, if you continue to say racist jokes and things that are racist, just because you have friends of a certain color or ethnic background does not mean that you are not racist. And really putting some firm boundaries down for both my father and actually my father-in-law, which got to be really uncomfortable. There are things that won't be acceptable to say in front of my children. And I think, you know, so much a part of my practice as an early childhood educator is defining things and expanding language for children, that I find myself doing that with adults. My husband points it out to me regularly. And so I find with some of these conversations, particularly around race, finding the definition, well, what does it mean to be racist or to do things that are racist? What is racism? And then being able to make some more connections. I find those conversations to be a bit easier in a one-on-one situation. I find that if you're having a conversation with someone where you are teasing that apart, doing it in a group can be really overwhelming and inappropriate. I find the most growth happens from those, like, let's just have a conversation about it, rather than coming from that accusatory standpoint. I think the other piece of that is modeling that practice. You know, my children have heard me have conversations, particularly with my father, and now I hear them having those conversations perhaps with peers of, I hear you saying you're not a racist, but if you say that joke, you're creating an environment where I feel uncomfortable. And so I'm going to ask you to stop.
I guess my question would be, and maybe Monica is asking it, is how would you teach that to children, the difference? I mean, we can talk about structural racism when we are a little bit older, but when we're talking to children, how do we make that distinction? And maybe that's your question, Monica.
Yeah.
It's more about what's developmentally appropriate, because as a parent, let's say not educated as Sarah and Bethany are, what's appropriate for a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, in reference to talking to them, what is racist, right? So I think that's kind of riffing on Cora's question.
Mm. Yeah, I think, with younger children, being able to have that standpoint of, oh, I've heard you say this, and this is something that could hurt children's feelings, and this is why. And kind of having it be, oh goodness, the university's working really hard to save money on lighting, and that means it keeps going dark, and I have to like wave my arms. And so I think keeping it clear and concise when you're talking to perhaps a 3-year-old about that. I think as they get older, you can expand upon that more. Well, why does it hurt someone's feelings? What does that really mean? So, and as I have a 10-year-old right now. I've had some of those conversations with her when she was an 8-year-old. And I think it's just, you can dive a little bit deeper and have them do a bit more perspective taking. If you were someone who was Black or Asian and you heard them say that, how do you think they might feel? And I think that can be this powerful piece. I don't know if you want to expand upon that, Bethany, at all.
Yeah, I was thinking about also like understanding the differences between like individual and group and structural. I tend to not use the phrase structural racism with children because it has a lot of syllables, instead, and we do a lot of this with the work that we do, reading books on activism. We talk about what rules are in place that affect different people differently. So for example, that comes into play with going back to the youngest marcher, it comes into play that there are rules in place about what people of color can do that impact them differently. And so then we'll bring it to the present, and we'll talk about, are there rules in place nowadays that affect different people differently? And so for both 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds, that's a conversation that they can have. When you're talking about like a 3-year-old, it can be harder. As far as I've been reading the HB2 rules, and then I read the guidance by the state, which doesn't seem to match the language of the two, but from what I understand, it's like that's within those rules, although don't take my word for it, go by the guidance of your school district. But understanding like historical experiences and current experiences, putting them together is, and considering similarities and differences is, from what I understand, not included in the restrictions of the bill. Although if somebody else has dug more deeply than I have, I would love to hear what they've found.
There's a question from Monica.
Yeah, I'm just throwing out questions, but if other members of the forum have questions, certainly unmute and ask.
I have a question. The events of this summer and the early spring hate AAPI incidents. Children are going back to school, and I worry about the Asian children going back to school given what they have experienced over the summer. What should parents look for? Children don't come home and tell their parents, so-and-so called me this, right? What should parents keep an eye on so that they, see what's going on with their children?
In my house, we have a practice of dinner time being a point where we talk about the peaks and the pits of the day. And so I think having an opportunity for children to have space to have a conversation about the really great parts of their day and the really challenging parts of the day can be helpful, but not every child is going to share something like that. I think I often see changes in behavior, what is typical, and that's tricky when you're having a transition, right? So you're going back to school and that's a transition in itself. But I think being really clued into your child's can be helpful. And then I think sometimes we see that around anxiety of going to school. Like, how does your child respond when you say it's time to go to school, or if you're saying particular names of children in the classroom or on the school bus? And I think, I have a group of children who are going off to kindergarten. And so some of the things that I've been thinking about in the right now is how do I reinforce some of this work we've done around self-advocacy and being able to stand up and say, this isn't okay. And also, how do you promote activism among children in the community and having them stand up for other children? And it's something that, I have the opportunity with the group I'm with currently. I've been with them since they were 3 and now they're 5. Some of them were 2 when I had them for the first time. Some of them were infants when I had them in a classroom. And so this is work that we've been slowly building upon over the course of their time at CSDC. And so I would, again, think about how do you engage with your child about the day? Do you see changes in their behavior? And what is the timing of those changes or the emotional response they might have about going to school? And then again, this piece of self-advocacy and activism.
Thank you.
I think, and then to add to Sarah's comment, I would engage the school counselor, and I would engage the teacher. And if the teacher doesn't understand that it's derogatory about race, I would go up the ladder. I would approach it from of course we're all going to work together to address this racialized incident. Mm-hmm. But if other people don't see the importance of it, I would be reaching out to allies within the district. I think one really important thing that the Oyster River Cooperative School District has is there's a lot of people on is it a task force on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Yeah, and so there are a lot of people who are working on creating creating an inclusive learning environment. And so if the teacher doesn't recognize it, I've seen that before. I had a friend whose child was in my son's class before we moved to New Hampshire. Like there was a racialized incident and the teacher didn't recognize it as one, or the damage that it could be doing to the child. And so she, unfortunately, we were in an environment where she didn't feel comfortable bringing that conversation further along. And it was also half a decade ago at this point too. So I feel like, or I hope that we're in a different place now. But it should go above. And if the people in power don't recognize the damage that it's doing to children, come talk to me and I'll help. Or I'm pretty sure anyone on this board would help. And then again, the school counselor, because that's real damage, and that is emotionally something that that might need to go beyond the support that a parent can give.
So
Thank you.
The 5 minutes that we have left, if anyone wants to write a question about, what would you like a future panel to address that may be helpful to the New Hampshire Racial Unity team about issues that are pressing for you? And then Ken, I think you wanted to say something. Otherwise, I have another question, but I can certainly hold off on that.
No, go ahead.
And Michelle has a question too.
Okay, let's go with Michelle.
So Michelle's question is, do you talk about slavery with 3 to 5 year olds?
I do. I so my language is different, and I don't talk about, I don't talk about every aspect of slavery, but I feel like it's an important part of our country, and it's an important part of the way that a lot of people in this country continue to experience life, and so I do talk about it with them. I don't talk about every single aspect. I don't sugarcoat it. There was one of the slides that I had was a book that got pulled from the shelves about two people making, like, it got recalled by the publisher because it told the story of two slaves making a cake for George Washington for his birthday and how happy and proud they were to get to make the cake. And like, so that's the thing, is not changing history because 3 to 5 year olds need to hear something, like, because I don't want 3 to 5 year olds to hear about the absolute brutality of slavery. Instead, I'll talk about how it like slavery was cruel, but I won't necessarily talk about those details until they get a little bit older. My son was obsessed with understanding slavery when he starting very, very young, and so I had to learn a lot of language around it at that point.
Yeah, I would agree. Those are conversations I have also had, and I have been doing a lot more learning recently about the language that I use. So I would say someone who was enslaved versus someone who is a slave, and thinking more about labeling the what they went through rather than having that be their identity. And I think, again, it's a lot of the conversations that I have with children are very individualized. So I have to know where that specific child is in their development in order to know how to respond to them. And I know that because of all the assessment that we're doing throughout the day in our classrooms, but also when I'm having those conversations with my children, I know where they are as well. And so I think that that's a huge piece of the puzzle that we haven't as much talked about, but really having that that window to where children are developmentally.
So I think that maybe one of the conversations we could have in the future would be, and this is the question I would have asked Sarah or Bethany, but there's not a lot of time. Have teachers come to you in the past 3 months to say, now that this new bill has passed, right? I'm a public school teacher. What can I teach? How can I teach it? What's going to fall within or without the parameters? Just kind of fear of maybe I can't teach what I have in the past in the way that I've had. And, we can't answer that in 1 minute now, but that is certainly something I think that a lot of public school teachers are worried about. So if you have anything in the next 30 seconds that you can contribute to, that would be great. And if not, for another session.
My quick soundbite is that human diversity is not divisive, and that as an educator, I have to take a stand. And I'm going to continue to teach what I have taught for the last 18 years. I mean, certainly it's evolved over the last 18 years and it will continue to evolve. But at some point, I sometimes worry about what this law says. I have the backup of being at the university. I do have my teaching license. I do run the risk of losing my teaching license. But again, I don't believe that human diversity is divisive.
As a board member of the Racial Unity Team, I would just like to make a comment about these last two issues, and I'm glad Monica brought that up. I've been very, very concerned about HB2 and the rules and regulations that have been spelled out by the Commissioner of Education, the Department of Justice, and the Commission on Human Affairs in our state. And I hope all teachers are aware of those. And it may take some extra special attention on the part of all teachers to preserve exactly what Sarah and Bethany have been stressing in terms of how to approach diversity in education. It is threatened. We're doing everything we can at the Racial Unity Team, and this panel is one example of how to address it. We need to have more people involved. I hope we can do that. And I want to thank you all. And in addition to that, I was a secondary school teacher many, many years ago. It's so refreshing and interesting and valuable for me to hear how you at the early childhood education level are dealing with issues of racism and diversity. I really appreciate that.
Yes, and I will chime in and say thank you so much, Bethany and Sarah. And I'm looking at Cora's note here that teachers are a gift. And I think it has been a gift for me that Sarah was my kid's teacher many years ago. So thank you for the work that you do and continue to do, and for being on the panel. It's been fun to have you and very educational as well. Thank you to all of the participants. And Ken, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to round up with, or.
Yeah, just a summary. Thank you all for joining us. Monica, thank you so much for all the hours you put into this. I appreciate it. And Sarah and Bethany, thank you so much. And of course, I have to thank my sponsor, New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, for making this possible. Visit us on our website, racialunityteam.com. And if you enjoyed this program, I appreciate it letting us know. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks for being
you.
here. Right.
Thank you.